Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we hear the origin story of the RAF hymn. We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, for more than a century, the RAF hasn't had its own hymn. With music being such a core aspect of life in the military, it's quite fitting that during the year of Her Majesty the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, this has finally changed. Our correspondent, Flt Lt Mark McKinstry, spoke with the people who made this happen.
Music touches our souls in ways that other things just can't do.
They're almost like the wallpaper for our life as service people. It's there if we need it.
Be with the brave whom duty calls through struggle to the stars.
Hello, my name's Flight Lieutenant Mark McKinstry. In this year of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, a new hymn specifically for the Royal Air Force has been created. As it will no doubt feature in RAF service life for years to come, I caught up with some of the key people involved to see how the new Royal Air Force hymn, Per Ardua ad Astra, came about. Firstly, Air Officer Commanding Scotland, Air Vice Marshal Ross Patterson.
Whilst the Air Force has used a couple of hymns over the years, one of them, Eternal Father, which of course has got a long history associated with the naval service, and also God is our strength and refuge, which typically is set to the Dam Busters March. We've never had our own hymn, and therefore, which seems odd considering that, we're now in our second century. So I'm delighted that we've now had the opportunity through the kindness of our two composers to create a unique, bespoke RF hymn for the first time. So as part of my work as Air Officer Scotland, as well as doing all the typical sort of public-facing events that people see to do with Remembrance and Edinburgh Tattoo and, events across the nation, I do a lot of other activities, perhaps more behind the scenes, especially with industry and academia, where we're looking to see what we can do to help not only youngsters get into STEM-related careers across Scotland, but also anything we can do to help people understand and work with the Air Force better up here. We have a great history of technology, of course, and as part of this, I'm in routine calls with some of the higher education and further ed establishments, and it was on a call absolutely completely unrelated to music, but with Aberdeen University, where we were looking at some space topics, ironically. But it was on that call that I was introduced to Paul Mealer, who's a professor of music up at the university. And it was in that initial conversation, I say initially to do with something completely different to this, whereby we discovered Paul's family links to the RAF. I told him about some of my work to do with preserving RAF history up here. We've created a Scottish aviation trail. And like all good conversations, one thing led to another. And at that point, bless him, he came up and offered, this amazing opportunity for him to compose our first ever bespoke hymn.
And why is it important to have a specific hymn for the RAF?
A hymn is different to a song in that sense. And, everybody's sense of faith and their view to religion is very different and very personal. But I happen to go to church, and hymns are songs of praise that are used to say thank you and say sorry, and we use them in in times of happiness and sadness. And so whilst it's, you know, it's part of the sort of historical culture, obviously, particularly of our nation and society here, and different nations with their own faith traditions will have their versions of it. But hymns say more. They're not just songs. Hymns talk about how we fit into perhaps, you know, a greater scheme of things and our responsibilities and duties to each other and to the world we live in. So I think, I speak perhaps from a little bit from a personal point of view here as someone that, you know, does go to church and does believe certain things. But I think hymns matter. And even if people only sing them once in a blue moon, you know, hopefully at happy events as well as sad events, typically, you know, one might expect these to be used at funerals, but hopefully perhaps at weddings and parades. You know, I think they play an important part of, they're almost like the wallpaper for our life as service people. It's there if we need it.
It's been 100 years of no hymn, and now the RAF has its own hymn, which will be, as you said, used at funerals, at weddings, at all sorts of celebrations. How does that make you feel to be sort of part of that as well?
There's a real risk now because I was 60 last year, which is pretty depressing actually on the big scheme of things. But it just gives me huge, quiet, personal satisfaction. I've been in the service, goodness me, over 38 years now, and I've just loved it. You know, I couldn't have wished or hoped for a happier or more fulfilling career. I've been very, very lucky, loved my service. And so to have been a small part of actually helping bring this to life, and the fact that it will hopefully endure and give people pleasure long after nobody's heard of me or anything like that. That's lovely, and that's very special just at a personal level.
So how do you think you'll feel the first time you're at an event or a ceremony and you hear the RAF hymn start up, you hear the first few bars?
I think, well, it'd be lovely. I really look forward to hearing it played by our musicians on a parade sketch. It's just going to be lovely to hear it, and I just really hope that people like it. You know, I've done this, as has Paul and Graham. You know, we've done this to hopefully provide pleasure and maybe comfort at some times, and you know, that's what it's about. It's not about us, but if it gives pleasure, then that's the joy. Very happy with that.
I travelled to the University of Aberdeen to speak to Professor of Music Paul Mealer.
In discussions with Air Officer Scotland, we realised that there wasn't an official hymn. There wasn't a hymn for the Royal Air Force, so I offered to write one. And I have close connections with the Royal Air Force, and so it meant a great deal to me to be able to give something back to this a brilliant organisation.
Tell me a little bit about your family links.
I have quite a few family members that have been involved in the Royal Air Force. I have cousins who not long finished their time. My grandfather served during the Battle of Britain. So it means a great deal to me to be able to connect through what is my gift, music, to them.
What characteristics of the RAF and flying, I suppose, did you want to convey in the music?
It's important to me in the music that it represents what the Royal Air Force does, and of course flying is the main thing that we think of, and so the music in essence takes off. It starts with piano and strings with these little fluttering, almost like feathers, and then as the hymn develops, the final verse, it just takes off into this enormous crescendo as we fly towards the Amen.
How important is music to the nation? How important is it to the RAF? Just how important is it in general, just to have music that can be attached to the RAF?
Music itself is one of the most important of all human creations. We can't imagine any point of our life where music isn't there. You know, we're born, there's a favourite song, we get married, there's a song that connects us, and when we pass away, we have hymns at our funeral. So music, particularly for this country, is incredibly important. And connected to a service like the Royal Air Force, to have something which is very much their own, I think is crucial, because it connects you all together. It's a song that we all sing. It's a piece that connects us spiritually, and even if you don't have a faith, it doesn't matter. You can still sing and be as one. It's an honour to be invited to do something like this. Very few composers get to do this kind of music that is ceremonial and spiritual at the same time. When I started writing this, you've got to put to the back of your mind that this is a hymn that's going to be sung, hopefully, for generations. It'll be sung at all important aspects of the Royal Air Force's history. You have to put that to the back of your head, because otherwise you'd never write anything, because you'd be weighed down by it. And so what I wanted to do is write something that felt like it's always been there. It's like one of those hymns, oh yeah, we've been singing this for 50, 60 years, 100 years. That's what I set myself to do. Hopefully I've achieved it. When you sit thinking about the kind of longevity of a piece, after you've written it, that's when it hits you. And you think, wow, I mean, this is such an honour to be part of this. For me, it's incredibly important to create something that feels like it's always been there. Because the hope is that it will continue to be there for a very long period of time. The Royal Air Force does an enormous amount for this country and indeed around the world. And for them now to have their own hymn, which they can sing with pride about who they are and what they do, I think is incredibly important and incredibly powerful for Graham and I, who wrote it, to be part of that. This hymn has been 2 years in the creation, and because of COVID-19, we've not been able to perform it. And so it seems now that we're beginning to come out of the pandemic, that it's the right moment, especially in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year. It seems the right moment that this piece finally gets heard. It was important to Graham and I, when we were writing the hymn, that we got in as many references as we could, biblical references to flight and to service. And I think Graham managed to get them all in, as far as I could see. But one particularly that was important to us, and indeed to the Royal Air Force, was a mention of a few. Those people, including members of my own family, who stood when it looked like all else was lost, and the turning point of the Second World War was their great effort. And so there's this one line, you know, to remain faithful to the few is in there, and I think that's just incredibly important to make that reference.
Are you happy with it?
The hymn?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, whenever you write something, creating stuff is a bit like having children, you know, you kind of love them, warts and all. Whenever I listen back to something, I always hear what I could have done better. But eventually, over time, you begin to see it. But yeah, I am happy with it. I think it does what I hoped it would. But in the end, it's up to the audience and the congregation. They tell you. And they're very honest about it.
You make the winds your messengers, your servants flames of fire. You raise them up on eagle's wings that tempests cannot tire. You make the clouds your chariot, the lightning bolt your blade. Give us your strength to keep from harm the heavens that you made. Although our path may lead from peace, and strife may stain the hand, it is through faith that we may fall, for love we leave the land. Through faith you fell beneath the cross, for love were lifted high. Go with the guardians of the earth, whose summons is the sky. You called your true companions to leave the land they knew. The keepers of your kingdom are the faithful and the few. You fought between the earth and sky. Your body bears the scars. Be with the brave whom duty calls through struggle to the stars.
Renowned poet, author and lyricist Graham Davies, who wrote the lyrics.
Paul Mealer and I have worked on a number of projects over the years, quite a few of them in fact commemorating major occasions such as the centenary of the Armistice, the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. So we have actually worked on quite a few major projects of this kind, and when we were asked to work on something for the RAF and to actually provide a hymn for the RAF, we thought this was a great opportunity to perhaps produce something which hopefully can do justice to this service and the men and women who serve within it, and hopefully provide something which can be of an inspiration to those people. There's quite a lot of different references in the hymn. The starting point for me really was the Psalms. As soon as I heard that the RAF were looking for a hymn, I immediately thought of going to the Psalms, and there I found the imagery which you'll see in the first verse. A little later on there's imagery from Isaiah, again then a little later from the New Testament. We worked in also, of course, the motto of the RAF, and finally then there is actually also a reference to the few as well, the word which is so closely identified with the RAF. So there's quite a lot of imagery there, all of it intended to bring out various aspects of the work of the RAF. The spiritual dimension is very important, certainly, and of course in quoting from the Psalms, from the New Testament, certainly we're acknowledging that, and we're touching those linguistic elements there that bring out that history and that heritage and those values. But hopefully within the words as well we can touch on and suggest aspects which people perhaps of no faith can also identify with, and find there something which hopefully puts into words what their own feelings are about the service.
How do you feel about the thought of this hymn being used for years to come?
Well, that's certainly an inspiring thought, and I know Paul and I would be absolutely thrilled to think that this is something that could do justice to the RAF and the men and women who serve within it, and everything that they do for this country and for this society. So that certainly is a very inspiring thought.
And of course someone who will sing this RAF hymn for years to come, RAF Deputy Chaplain-in-Chief, Group Captain Hayek.
It's a real pleasure for me today to be talking about this first ever dedicated hymn for the Royal Air Force, and to give a huge vote of thanks to both Paul Mealer and to Graham Davies for gifting this to us at this time. I'm particularly excited by the fact that this hymn's title is Per Ardua ad Astra, through adversity to the stars, which is of course the motto of the Royal Air Force. And I'm sure you and everybody you know has been through a time of adversity in the last couple of years. And one of the things we talk about in the Royal Air Force to give us strength through adversity, through the sacrifice and through the difficulties of our service, is our resilience. And in particular, as a chaplain, we talk about our spiritual resilience. And our spiritual resilience for somebody of faith is very often to do with that faith. And singing hymns is part of my Christian faith. And this gift of this new hymn today is fantastic, because over the last couple of years we've all experienced that loss of not being able to sing together in churches and in schools and in choirs, something that we've taken for granted for years and have suddenly realised how important it is. And for me, as a Christian, singing as part of that community and worshipping God is really important for gaining that resilience. But of course, not everybody in the Royal Air Force is of faith, and we seek out our spiritual resilience in different ways. And one of those ways is to look to the past and to look to those who've gone before us, who give us that inspiration to the future. And this hymn does that beautifully in referencing the few, in referencing their sacrifice and looking to the future for the hope that is set before us. And another thing that we all do, I think, as human beings for our spiritual resilience is look to music. Music touches our souls in ways that other things just can't do. And I think that music giving us that little element of courage, that little element of hope into the future is really important for all of us. And so as I look forward to singing this hymn many, many times into the future, I look forward to doing exactly that, to worshipping God through this hymn, to gaining that little bit of courage through singing alongside my colleagues and my friends, and for gaining inspiration from our past and hope for the future.
Wing Commander Piers Morrell, the Royal Air Force Principal Director of Music.
We're delighted to have had a hymn composed by the composer Paul Mealer and the lyricist Graham Davies, Per Ardua ad Astra, a hymn for the Royal Air Force, as we are now well and truly into our second century. This hymn will be part of our annual service, I'm sure, at the Founders' Day service at St Clement Danes, the Royal Air Force Church. I think also there is scope to include the hymn at our other services held throughout the year, most notably at Westminster Abbey for the annual Battle of Britain service as well. I think the words for the hymn very much align to the title, Per Ardua ad Astra, the motto for the Royal Air Force. And for me personally, there are two lines that really stand out. In the second verse, we hear, "Go with the guardians of the earth, whose summons is the sky." Very much a notable call to the aviators who have supported the Royal Air Force over the last century. And then the hymn finishes, "Be with the brave whom duty calls through struggle to the stars." And I think that absolutely resonates with the motto and the title, Per Ardua ad Astra, absolutely fitting for the Royal Air Force. Within military music, there has been a long-standing tradition of celebrating and commemorating, and most notably for any of the armed forces, there would be a drumhead ceremony, where the drums of the musicians would be laid as a temporary altar for the chaplain, be it on deployed operations or in the field of theatre of war, to then hold a religious service. Music would always be played, hymns would be sung, and I think this ties into that long-standing tradition, and we are delighted that for any future drumhead ceremony, we now have a hymn for the Royal Air Force to be performed as well. So music has gone alongside all the operations of the Royal Air Force over the last century and into this current one. Both in the UK and overseas, we have musicians supporting, be it the work of the defence attachés, but also local councils and authorities, where we have freedom parades where the troops can process through the town, supported by one of the Royal Air Force bands. For overseas engagement, it is such a leveller, the universal language of music. It is very easy for us to cooperate with allied partners and host nations as well, and it had always been a pleasure to perform alongside their musicians. On behalf of Royal Air Force Music Services and the Royal Air Force, our sincere thanks to Paul Mealer, the composer, and the lyricist Graham Davies for creating Per Ardua ad Astra.
Okay, so Per Ardua ad Astra, please, ladies and gentlemen. We're rolling, Tom?
We are, sir, yes.
Just keep it running all the way through.
SAC Victoria Andrews, and this is Reheat on Inside Air. The UK Armed Forces will play a central role in Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee celebrations this week. A special fly past to mark the occasion will see 70 aircraft fly over London on Thursday, June the 2nd, coinciding with the end of Trooping the Colour, the Queen's birthday parade at Horse Guards. Air Commodore Mike Balkwell explains who'll be taking part in this special event.
It's across all three services, so Royal Navy, British Army and Royal Air Force, flying them in from all around the country, so all the air bases that we have taking part. So this accuracy that we show in the flypast is what we do on operations every day.
Elsewhere, Typhoons from RAF Lossiemouth's 1 fighter squadron have joined aircraft from Belgium, Spain, France and the Czech Republic to take part in Exercise Vigilant Falcon in Lithuania. In their role, the jets carried out both simulated air combat and air strikes to support land forces. They then took part in Exercise Hedgehog in Estonia. Officer commanding 1 fighter squadron, Wing Commander Cockcroft, said, "This provides an excellent training opportunity in a joint environment to enable us to maintain some of our skills across the multiple roles that the Typhoon is able to undertake." Meanwhile, another significant NATO exercise has been taking place in North Macedonia. Exercise Swift Response involves 9,000 personnel from 17 NATO and partner nations, taking place across the Arctic, Balkans and the Baltic region. The exercise began with a high-altitude, low-opening parachute jump from a C-17 Globemaster. C-130 Hercules, Typhoons and Chinooks are also taking part. And finally, a new aircraft type to Royal Air Force service is to be named the Envoy 4. 2 new Dassault 900LX aircraft will transport members of the royal family, government and military leaders around the world. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm SAC Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of Puma and Chinook helicopters starting up during rehearsals for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee flypast. The Puma HC Mark II is capable of carrying 16 passengers, 12 fully equipped troops, or up to 2 tons of freight. It can also be fitted with up to 6 stretchers for operations in medical emergency response. The aircraft can be prepared for transport by C-17 in just 4 hours, then flown across the globe and be rebuilt just as quickly at its destination. The Chinook is iconic for its twin-engine tandem rotors. Primarily used for trooping, resupply and battlefield casualty evacuation, the aircraft can lift a wide variety of complex underslung or internal freight, including vehicles. Look to the skies over Buckingham Palace on Thursday the 2nd of June 2022 to see both the Chinook and Puma helicopters in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee flypast.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.